In this video, I'll share what I think is Schubert's most sublime melody, occurring in my personal favorite of his hundreds of masterpieces, the C Major String Quintet, completed just months before his untimely death at the age of only 31. Schubert is particularly famous for his nearly unparalleled talent for lyricism, in other words, the tunefulness of his tunes. So it's difficult to choose a most sublime melody from such a wealth of options. A classic example of this lyricism that I easily could have chosen instead is this simple yet nearly supernaturally gorgeous melody from his famous G-flat major Impromptu. Those of you who already know the C Major String Quintet, considered by many to be Schubert's greatest large-scale composition, might have already guessed that I chose for this video the otherworldly second theme from its opening movement, a melody so beloved by classical musicians that at least one prominent violinist, John Saunders, who led the Royal Philharmonic Society's orchestra, actually had it engraved on his tombstone. Part of what makes this theme so heavenly is the way it magically appears in the context of the larger structure. So let's discuss that structure by first listening to the opening theme of this large sonata-form movement, played by the first violin. This static, disjointed opening almost sounds more like a slow introduction, until a crescendo finally launches us into a more energetic section, beginning with these imitative red staccato figures. All this new action makes it difficult to recognize the repeat of the same static opening theme by the cellos, since at first it just seems to be a long tonic pedal point. This new red figure reminds me of this similar figure you might remember from my video on the finale of Mozart's Linz Symphony. Back to Schubert, we now hear a tension-building crescendo over this dominant pedal point that builds to this dramatic cadence on a G major chord. This emphatic G major chord sets the stage for the magical entrance of the second subject, though at this point it's unclear to me whether we've actually modulated to G major or just lingered on a dominant pedal point for many bars. This type of ambiguity is common in the sonata forms of Mozart and Haydn, like for example in the first movement of Haydn's 48th Symphony, also in C major. Notice how instead of an obvious modulation to the dominant, we hear a similar dominant pedal point and a cadence to G major, but it still doesn't seem like we've left the key of C major until the second subject rather startlingly appears immediately in the new key. I like to call this an unprepared second subject, and one of its advantages is that no real changes are necessary when it returns in the recapitulation section, other than transposing it back to the tonic, which can sound even more satisfying since our ears are used to the more unexpected jump to the dominant from the exposition section. I'll replay the passage from the exposition, followed by its return in the recapitulation, so you can hear this effect without listening to everything in between. I nostalgically chose the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra's recording of this symphony because this was the first Haydn recording I ever listened to when I first became obsessed with classical music at the age of 7, so I guess I've been thinking about unprepared second subjects for a long time now. Back to Schubert, this dramatic G major chord, depending on what comes after, could become the new tonic key, or if we remain in C major, could still just sound like a dominant chord, the two options we just heard in the Haydn symphony. Instead, Schubert does neither of these and pivots to the more surprising distant key of E flat major, the flat mediant of the opening C major. I almost consider these two introductory bars to be part of the theme itself, since they so brilliantly modulate to this unexpected new key with this chromatic descent. Notice that this theme first appears as a duet between the two cellos, in a higher register than the accompanimental pizzicato notes from the viola. Now listen just to the first phrase of this theme. I'll highlight the lower portion of the duet with a slightly darker green color, since it eventually becomes more independent. So, remembering the Haydn example, Schubert, now in this same situation, easily could have just remained in C major. Or could have easily jumped to G major. Back to what Schubert actually wrote. Notice that this first phrase just ended by immediately pivoting back to a G major chord. But now, in the context of E flat major, it sounds like a secondary dominant 5 of 6 chord. That would normally resolve to C minor, the 6th chord or relative minor of E flat major. But instead, Schubert begins the next phrase again in E flat major, so we're just hearing the same surprising chromatic mediant relationship from before, but this time without the two modulatory bars. Before going on, if you remember that Berlioz cello quote I've mentioned in other videos, you'll realize that whenever you see a cantabile cello theme being played in a higher register than the accompanying viola, it's often a sign that something breathtakingly beautiful is occurring. Another exquisite example of this is the very passage from the finale of Mahler's First Symphony that inspired me to mention that quote for the first time 7 years ago. Back to Schubert, notice that in this second phrase, he elongates this G from the first phrase to set up my favorite stunning moment of this whole composition. This unexpected elongation that decrescendos as the second cello repeats this dotted figure, almost like an echo fading out, makes us wonder when this second phrase is actually going to end. The lack of harmonic movement, just lingering on this E-flat major chord, emphasized by the echoing dotted figures, creates a brief moment when time seems to be suspended, and this makes the sublime shift back to C major in the next bar, another chromatic mediant relationship, even more poignant. Almost nothing gives me more goosebumps than this third dotted figure in the second cello part that gives us a 16th note duration preview of this stunning new C major chord with this E natural. As you listen to this moment, notice that all these prolonged G's in the melody are actually a common tone of G major, E flat major, and C major, the three keys of interest in this section and of course in this whole movement. The sublime shift back to C major we just heard seems like a true modulation since it's immediately reinforced by a 4-5-1 progression in C major. But by the end of the theme, we finally, possibly for the first time, seem like we've truly modulated to G major, thanks to the same 4-5-1 progression now in G major. However, subverted expectations are part of what makes this theme so amazing. So now everything we've heard so far repeats, but now played by the first and second violins, including these two modulatory bars. The persistent rhythmic accompaniment continues, but now played by the lowest three instruments, and now with triplets. Another subtle and brilliant modification this second time is that the prolonged G's in the melody are now tied between phrases, making these common tone modulations sound even more natural, though no less breathtaking. finally in the dominant key of G major for the remainder of this gigantic exposition section. Schubert, like Brahms and Bruckner decades later, frequently used this strategy of 3 large key areas in the exposition instead of 2, with the second in a distant key, often with a mediant relationship. Of course, I pointed out in this prior video Mozart's much earlier use of the exact key relationships we just heard, though on a much smaller scale, in the opening movement of his K464 quartet, that begins in A major, modulates to a brief second theme in the flat mediant key of C major, and quickly modulates to the third theme in the dominant key of E major. And of course we have other pieces that predate Schubert, like the opening movement of Beethoven's C major Waldstein Sonata, that never modulates to the dominant at all, instead replacing it entirely with the mediant key of E major. Returning to Schubert, we now hear a spectacular, nearly completely strict canon at the octave between the first violin and the viola, playing these phrases related to the green theme we just heard, now with this even faster 16th note accompaniment, and with the continuing persistent pizzicato rhythm from the second cello. Although once the canonic section we just heard begins, we never really leave G major for the remainder of the exposition, notice the nearly immediate B major chord, another chromatic mediant relationship, just another 5 of 6 chord tonicizing the relative E minor. The end of this brief excursion to E minor is another of my favorite moments when the B major chord magically shifts right back to G major with this strange D sharp to D natural in the first violin, and with the B as the common tone between the chords. I often wonder whether the texture of the canonic portion we just heard, with imitative counterpoint between 2 instruments, 16th note broken chords in another, and pizzicato in the lowest instrument, might have been inspired by the similar texture of that spectacular moment in Beethoven's Opus 74 harp quartet that I discussed in one of my first analysis videos. Notice Beethoven's similar imitation at the octave, the 16th note broken chords, and the pizzicato bass. Back to Schubert, since this is mostly a video about this green theme, let's skip to the end of this huge exposition section, when we suddenly hear this new mischievous march-like closing theme. Its final portion now becomes an imitative motif that accompanies the return of the green theme to end the exposition. The development section begins by repeating what we just heard, but now in A major. But after this one appearance of the green theme, the entire development section is based only on the orange closing theme, often with imitative counterpoint of its first portion combined with imitative counterpoint of its final portion. The orange theme initially had a harmless, impish character. But now these intense bouts of counterpoint transform it into something much more menacing, with these jarring half-step dissonances. I'll now play the end of the exposition and the beginning of the development, so you can hear this transformation. Now let's jump to the reappearance of the green theme in the recapitulation section. The key relationships from the exposition section are preserved, but now everything is transposed down a perfect fifth, with the pivot occurring much earlier, making the preparatory pedal point now a C instead of a G. Also, this time the second cello and viola trade responsibilities, so although the melody is still being played by the first cello, the viola now at least gets some of the glory, especially since it now gets to play my favorite 16th note of the entire piece. Of course, shortly after this, when the canonic portion returns, Schubert gives the violist a demotion, assigning the canonic imitation originally played by the viola now to the first cello, though I'm sure many of the virtuosity-obsessed musicians in the world would instead consider this a promotion to the more important part. While I'm talking about cellos versus violas, I have to discuss Schubert's choice to score this piece for 2 cellos instead of the more traditional instrumentation of 2 violas. I say traditional since most composers before Schubert, including both Mozart and Beethoven, wrote viola quintets, but this may not have been the more common scoring, thanks entirely to one composer and virtuoso cellist, Luigi Boccherini, who composed 141 string quintets, all for 2 cellos. Most of you probably recognize at least one theme from this vast body of works. I'm not sure how this one tune became so popular, but it does make you wonder what Boccherini would think if he came back to life and discovered that his entire impressive output was mostly being ignored, except for this one minuet that mostly only exists in an artistic netherworld inhabited by intoxicated wedding guests and thousands of Suzuki Method students. Back to Schubert, the 2 cellos are really what makes this piece what it is. From these intense, growling doubled entries of the original blue theme we heard at the beginning, to the gorgeous duet that was the main focus of this video. Sadly, and astonishingly, this masterpiece wasn't published or performed until the 1850s, but this was just in time to inspire the young Brahms, who was just beginning his illustrious career as a composer of chamber music. Only a decade after the Schubert Quintet was rediscovered, Brahms composed, in my opinion, his greatest chamber work, the Opus 34 Piano Quintet. Many people know this quintet existed previously as a sonata for 2 pianos, a version that Brahms also published, but not as many know that it was originally conceived as a string quintet, scored for 2 cellos, a choice that was likely inspired by the recently discovered Schubert quintet. And if you need more evidence that one piece influenced the other, listen to the ferocious ending of Brahms's scherzo movement. These last 3 bars seem to be a fairly obvious quotation of the wild, unexpectedly sinister ending of Schubert's finale. Of course, many years later, Brahms did actually compose 2 string quintets, but he opted for Mozart's instrumentation of 2 violas, though perhaps he placated any angry cellists by opening the second quintet with this immortal cello solo. Returning to the first movement of the Schubert quintet, as you listen to the return of this section, notice one final brilliant alteration. These introductory 2 bars now have 1 additional note, making the descent entirely chromatic this time, and giving the violist 1 additional note to linger on and create additional suspense before we hear the surprising new key. Before we hear the final appearance of this green melody in the coda section, I have to give an honorable mention to what I think is Schubert's other most sublime melody, depending on the day you ask me, not surprisingly from the Adagio second movement of this same piece. This gorgeous, slow, chorale-like theme, played by the middle 3 instruments, is decorated by a call and answer between these pizzicato notes from the second cello and these dotted figures from the first violin. Part of what makes this theme, the green theme from the first movement, and so many other Schubert themes so exquisite are the brilliant modulations that occur within them. So listen for the three most breathtaking moments of this theme, all involving this luscious legato arching figure played by the first violin, combined with this 16th note plucked rising cello figure. The first of these helps modulate from the opening key of E major up a whole step to F sharp major. This is accomplished by first going to F sharp minor, the 2 chord, then a 5/7 of 2 chord to tonicize F sharp that now returns as a major chord that now starts to sound like the new tonic, making this B major chord sound like a subdominant 4 chord instead of a dominant 5 chord. And finally, we hear a 4-5-1 progression in F sharp major to firmly establish this as the new key. Now listen up to this point, paying most attention to the first of the 3 stunning moments I mentioned before. The theme now starts to repeat in F sharp major, but this surprise forte B minor chord, a minor 4 chord, is the pivot chord of another brilliant modulation, becoming the 2 chord of a 2-5-1 progression to A major. A major is short-lived because it becomes the 4 chord of another 4-5-1 progression back to the opening key of E major, an elegant and heavenly tonal journey that ends up where it began. Part of what makes these modulations so mind-blowing is Schubert's penchant for enhancing the effect by creating suspense in or prolonging the preceding material. In this theme, this is inherent in its extremely slow-moving sustained notes, but remember the same phenomenon we heard in the first movement when he used this suspenseful chromatic descent and later this suspenseful elongated note to heighten the effect of the modulations they precede. The result of these techniques is a theme in the first movement that, as I mentioned before, one famous musician had carved into his gravestone, and a theme in the second movement that was so adored by pianist Arthur Rubinstein that he asked his wife to play it on his deathbed, as you can hear in this 1969 documentary.
There is that quintet of Schubert which he wrote before he died. This is something which I love more than anything I can tell you. It went so far that I asked my wife to play it, even on a record, when I will be dying in some decent way, you know, I mean, in my bed. It is, you see, the entrance to heaven. I mean, Schubert wrote the music which gives the peace, the feeling of the nothing, of entering death, resigned and happy.
Speaking of death, Schubert's lifelong hero, Beethoven, had tragically died the year before the composition of this quintet, and I've often wondered if Schubert's probable realization that he had just inherited Beethoven's mantle as the greatest living composer helped make possible his nearly supernaturally productive final year. Many of the masterpieces composed during this year contain overt tributes to his fallen hero, and I've often wondered if this theme is one of them, since it reminds me of this similarly sumptuous theme from Beethoven's Fidelio. Notice the similar, slow-moving, almost non-melodic melody that also has a plucked bass line and a compound meter. And remember that years earlier, Schubert had supposedly sold all of his school books at the age of 17 in order to attend the premiere of the final version of Fidelio in 1814. Now, before returning to the first movement, I can't resist one more comparison between these decorative dotted first violin figures with grace notes and the similar figures from the actual theme of Schubert's own F minor Fantasy for four hands, also composed during that final year. Finally returning to the first movement, the orange and green themes reappear at the end of the recapitulation section, like we saw in the exposition section, to introduce the coda section that begins with the opening blue theme, but now intensified by these alarming 16th note arpeggios. This leads to one final volley of the imitative red figures, a dramatic dominant chord, and one final variant of the green theme before the final chords of the movement.